So once again, now that we're recording, welcome to our August webinar. Our topic this evening will be basic principles of relapse prevention. Before I continue, I just want to remind you that the poll for next month's webinar is open, so make sure to vote. And then once I'm done with this, I will close the poll and tell you what we'll talk about next month. Yeah, that's it. I don't think I have any other preliminary announcements, except that, of course, if you have a topic you'd like me to talk about in the future, either type it in the chat here and then I'll copy it into the polls later on, or email me the topic and then it will be here next time so that you can vote for it. So without losing any more time, let's get started. If it would only change slides. Okay, so these are some of the topics that we will address this evening. So why pay attention to relapse prevention and when is the right time to think about it? What is relapse prevention to begin with? We'll differentiate between triggers and risk factors. This is something that we usually lump together, and that's typically fine. But here, when we talk about relapse prevention, it really does make sense to separate them. So I'll make sure to explain the difference. We will talk about discipline and how to select and adhere to the techniques that you select. We'll talk about first aid techniques and then some ideas or suggestions maybe for deeper work that can help you in the long run. I just want to say that even if you're just starting your kind of healing process and if you're just starting to work on pulling less, it doesn't mean that this webinar is not useful for you. Essentially, when we talk about relapse prevention, we're talking about condensing everything we've learned, either going through therapy or self-help or any kind of healing process that worked for you, and then kind of just taking out the essentials. So if you're just starting now, this can serve as a roadmap, let's say, of the territories and that you're supposed to conquer, topics that you're supposed to address, and skills that you need to acquire in order to heal successfully. So even if you're just getting started, this could also be helpful for you. So let's see why and when is the right time to use and think about relapse control. So the moment to think about creating a relapse control plan is once you've achieved significant reduction in pulling or you have stopped pulling completely. And so you want to prevent either pulling becoming worse or coming back at all. So that's the time to think about creating your relapse prevention plan. Now, this is the second time that I'm using the word plan, and this is very important because relapse prevention is not just one thing that you do. It is a much more complex thing, and it does require a systematic approach. Otherwise, you will get lost, and if you end up confused and anxious about it, it sort of defeats the purpose of having a relapse prevention plan to begin with. So it needs to be organized, and I will suggest a way for you to organize it, and then you can take that suggestion and apply it to yourselves and customize it further. So relapse prevention, therefore, is really important to consider if we're aiming to preserve the progress that we've made. We don't do relapse prevention just with BFRBs. It's something that you do no matter, like any kind of change that you want to make, any kind of behavioral that you struggle to change, you will need to think about relapse prevention. Relapse prevention essentially means being proactive. It means taking the best of what you've learned and then elaborating a set of measures so that you can apply them in a timely manner. Essentially, relapse prevention includes different ways of mitigating risk factors, those things that may lead to pulling, and then developing discipline in order to regularly adhere to the techniques and lifestyle changes that you know work. As I said, it essentially condenses everything that is achieved in therapy or with self-help Here, I will refer to therapy because I'm a therapist, so that's what I do. And when I use relapse control and when I help people create their relapse prevention plan, uh, I do that after therapy, not self-help. So essentially, it shows the full scope of changes that are necessary to make in order to successfully deal with a problem in the long run. Because stopping pulling for a month is possible with a couple of techniques, but if you want to make sure that you stop pulling for forever, let's say, or for longer periods of time, then you need to address the problem more systematically. And that's what we aim to do with a relapse prevention plan. Because as you go through therapy, you will try, especially, I can at least speak for myself as a therapist, and I can speak for TrickStop as a platform because I know it well. I work for it. Um, Throughout the process of therapy, the months that you spend in treatment, you will try 10, 20, maybe even more different techniques. Some won't work for you, some will work so-so, some will work very well. Among those that work very well, there will be some that are easier to apply, some that are more difficult to apply. So uh, you don't need all of them. The goal, at least the trick stop, is to give you tools to attack the problem from several different perspectives, but you don't necessarily need to use each and every one of those for the rest of your life. Otherwise, it would make the rest of your life rather complicated. So in that sense, when we create a relapse prevention plan, we assess and scrutinize each and every one of these and then select only those that work the best. We can think of relapse prevention as having several key components. This is, let's say, roughly how we do it in the program. I somewhat simplified it so that, because my idea is that each and every one of you can, after this, sit down, take a piece of paper, and then assess what you've done and create your own relapse prevention plan. Which is why I somewhat simplified it, because when you do it with a therapist, it is a different experience. So some of these components would be mindfulness, self-care, precautionary measures, coping strategies, first aid. Right? We will address each of these categories as we go through the webinar. One thing that I want to mention is I keep saying the word plan, right? Uh, if you can if you can create a table, or even better, some kind of a visual representation of your relapse prevention plan, that would be excellent. Because it has all these components, it's really difficult to keep all of that in your head. In the program, we have the worksheets that you can use, and then you can kind of organize it that way in let's say, a little booklet in the end. What I prefer even more, but TrickStop as a platform, at least for now, doesn't offer that possibility, is to create a graphic representation, like a relapse prevention board, for example. I've had clients who would make collages or sketch them out in some way. Those in PowerPoint, if you ever make presentations, those charts that include like processing or branching out, like those would be a good idea. If you know how to do mind mapping, you can create your relapse prevention plan using mind maps rather easily. So that's something that you can consider. Visual representations are always better than just writing a text or even making a list, because our brains remember, or for most people at least, their brains remember better that way. So if you're working on a mind map, you would put obviously relapse prevention in the center, and then each of these things that I listed here, mindfulness, self-care, precautionary measures, would be one major branch. And then you would kind of branch out with what you have to add for each category. Uh, I will now explain each of these briefly so that you understand how to start working on them. So the first one is mindfulness. And when I talk about mindfulness here, I don't talk about meditation necessarily. You all know that I meditate regularly, that I teach meditation, and that I will always advise people to meditate. But that's not really truly what I mean. When I say mindfulness, is just another way of saying having awareness. This is not only the first part of your relapse prevention plan, this is also, in a way, the bedrock of your entire treatment and the entire process of change. I mean, think about it very practically on a completely superficial level. If you're not aware that you're pulling or that you're about to pull, then what what use is there in having efficient techniques when you won't be able to use them? Or think about having precautionary measures to deal with triggers. If you're not aware that a trigger is in your environment or that you're going to encounter one, what is the point of finding precautionary measures? So without mindfulness, it's kind of pointless to talk about anything else. Uh, as I said, it doesn't mean that you have to sit there and practice mindfulness daily, although, by all means, if you want to try, do it. It can also be just remembering to check in with yourself throughout the day. Let's say if you have a sedentary job, which most people these days have, and you start pulling after a while, it could be useful to set an alarm for, I don't know, like every hour or every hour and a half, depending on the kind of work that you do. And then whenever the alarm goes off, you pay attention to how you feel. And here you don't have to spend, 15 minutes contemplating your feelings. It's sufficient to notice as you go through the program or in whatever treatment you're in, it's sufficient to notice where in your body stress and tension accumulate, because this is, or how the urge manifests for you. For most people, that would be paying attention to your shoulders, to your chest, to your abdomen. But it can be different for different people. For example, sometimes people feel like their hands and their fingers are full of energy. So in that case, that's what you pay attention to. So you don't have to do a complete body scan. You don't have to sit and meditate for 15 minutes. Just find those really important and very active zones, and then check in with yourself. So that's something that you can introduce and make a daily habit out of. You can One thing that I like to give to my mindfulness students, so not in therapy, is different assignments that are weekly, and then every week they have to pay attention to a different facet of their experience and in different ways. So my favorite go-to, the one that I always start that with, is to tell them every time you walk through a doorway, pause for a couple of seconds and then pay attention to your chest or to your abdomen. Because when I teach mindfulness, my goal is to make them, aware of as many aspects of their experience as possible. But you don't have to go that much, you don't have to do it that widely if you don't want to. It's perfectly okay, and it's sufficient to just focus on those areas that are pertinent to pulling. So if you feel the urge, I don't know, as a tingling in your scalp or pressure in your chest, or I don't know, like feeling in your legs or whatever, I've heard many different ways to describe it over the years. Just every time you walk through a doorway, let's say, sit and pay attention to those areas just for a couple of seconds and see if there's something there. Then next week you can change that and say, every time I take a sip of any kind of liquid, I will pay attention to this. The idea behind shifting these I don't know, checkpoints, or however you want to call them, is to spontaneously, is first of all not to make it just a mindless habit, but to keep yourself vigilant, to keep yourself aware of different aspects. So when you change these every day or every week, then you're kind of forced to remain mindful. So this may seem like a lot of work, but being mindful allows you to be proactive and to quickly notice difficult emotions or potentially triggering thoughts. And then it also allows you to track your emotional state of mind, to pay attention to your anxiety and to pay attention to your stress. If these are things that eventually lead to pulling for you or some kind of restlessness, then being mindful is extremely important. And overall, just infusing more mindfulness in your everyday life will improve your mood, will lower your anxiety levels, your stress levels, it'll make you more resilient. So overall, having more mindfulness is really never a bad thing, and you will experience benefits that extend beyond just relapse prevention. But this should be your first branch. Maybe none of what I described just now works for you, But then think about ways that you establish mindfulness. Maybe it's a grounding exercise for you. For some people, it can be playing certain kinds of music, anything that will get you to focus on your internal experiences. So that would be the first important category. And you don't need 10 different techniques to establish mindfulness. Let's say one or two are sufficient. If you want to practice mindfulness by sitting or lying down and then doing a body scan or focusing on your breath, that could be one. So one can be formal mindfulness, although this is not necessary. I have to emphasize that. For example, in acceptance and commitment therapy, we talk about mindfulness without meditation. So just because it's our first association doesn't mean that that's how it has to be done. And then the second approach can be something informal, some kind of mindfulness without meditation. So just two, for example, would be sufficient for this category. Because there are several categories, it's really advisable not to overload yourself, right? Because this is supposed to be something you do every day and for as much of the time during the day as you can. So you don't want to make something convoluted or complicated or unrealistic. At the same time, you will have to change your routine slightly, no matter what kind of mindfulness you try to practice. But that's just the cost of change, a burden that we have to price that we have to pay. So that would be the first category. The second category is self-care. Uh, Self-care can include really many different things. And I listed here some things that are useful, although not all of them will be relevant for every one of you. So here you have to think about what you actually need. First, let me clear something up. When I say self-care, I really don't mean, like lighting candles and I don't know, like you, taking a bath or going to take a massage or anything like that. Like if that's what you like to do, by all means, knock yourself out, enjoy, that's fine. But specifically here, when I talk about self-care, what I actually mean is introducing certain lifestyle changes that promote your well-being in the long run. A massage might be relaxing or a nice long bath and a glass of wine might also be relaxing, but that's short term. So that's maybe not self-care, it's kind of indulging a little bit. It's fine. But in my definition of self-care, it's something that contributes to our well-being in the long run. These changes are usually quite difficult to make because sometimes they require you not just to make time, they also require certain sacrifices. So let me explain some of these examples. So a good hair care routine, I don't think is that difficult to understand. This is especially important if you like to pull on your split ends or cut them off. It's also very important if the sensory aspect of individual hairs is important for you. Then by having a good hair care routine, you will make your hairs smoother, so you'll have fewer triggers. Stress management and anxiety management, obviously huge triggers for most people. So therefore very important to deal with. But these are not things that we do once or twice. So this is always an ongoing process. So if you have to deal with stress and reduce stress, you don't do two things and then you're done with it. It's a process. So you have to learn strategies, then evaluate them from time to time because nothing lasts forever. So strategies need to be replaced. Then you can focus on cultivating certain attitudes towards yourself that will increase your well-being. Things like self-compassion, forgiveness, acceptance. These I don't want to risk sounding a little sappy when I talk about them. These are very practical and concrete things. Um, we can talk about the esoteric stuff, but when you draw the line, all of these are very practical. So self-compassion just means adopting an attitude of wanting to reduce your own suffering in everyday life. So it means that, let's say, you're tempted to pull one hair, and then instead of being upset with yourself, you comfort yourself. When you resist pulling one hair, then you reward yourself instead of being upset that you came very close. Because when you get upset with yourself, you're just making yourself even more excited, more stressed, more anxious, feeling guilty, and then you're likely to pull again. Whereas self-compassion will say, okay, so now I'm suffering, and it's better to suffer less than to suffer more. So self-compassion always gets you to look for very practical, down-to-earth ways to ease your own suffering. Uh, so it's simple, but not always easy to apply, especially if you have low self-worth, then you might not think you're worthy of compassion. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Uh, Forgiveness and acceptance also belong to this category. Acceptance, I think, is important to explain because acceptance doesn't mean I will just accept the fact that I will continue to pull forever. That's not what we're going for. But without acceptance, you can't even deal with certain aspects of hair pulling. Acceptance, in my interpretation of the word, just means seeing things clearly, seeing the good stuff clearly, but also seeing the ugly stuff clearly. That means that sometimes you have to see things about you that are not very flattering, and but in order for them to change, you really have to be able to see them. Imagine doing an operation on a person but not being able to look at blood, or fixing a car but then with your eyes closed. It's like you can't change without seeing the problem clearly. So acceptance is something that definitely facilitates your well-being, and it's at the same time a very difficult attitude to implement, because let's say I'm just kind of thinking of an example now. I have a client. I mean, I've had many clients over the years, but currently I have a client in therapy who is extremely perfectionist. And just recently, she wrote in Trick Stop, she wrote a sentence that I have read several times over the past few years, which is, um, I would easily love myself if I only did things perfectly. And I thought, that just means you told me you'll never love yourself because you're a living human being and you'll never do anything perfectly. So acceptance is extremely difficult for this client because it means seeing your own flaws and seeing your own limitations. And that's not always easy to see. It means also seeing when we mess up, when we say the wrong thing, when we hurt the people we love or ourselves. It means just looking at it very clearly, but looking at it without judgment. It's not, let's say you have 10 things to do at work, but you only do two things. It's not acceptance to say, my God, you were so lazy today, because lazy is a value judgment. Acceptance doesn't judge. Acceptance tells you, so things are like this, period. I didn't do this and I was supposed to, period. No calling yourself names, right? Because when you approach things that way, it makes it really easier to see what is it that you can't achieve right now. And one of the self-care attitudes that are extremely important, very, very significant, but also something that many of my clients over the years have resisted implementing, is acknowledging your boundaries and limitations. Um, let's say you're very ambitious and you're chasing after a position in your company, but that requires you to work, I don't know, 15 hours a day. And that means no exercise, no healthy food, not enough sleep, overworked, neglecting your relationships. Uh, and all that causes additional stress. So you pull. Uh, Perhaps what you're pulling is telling you is that if that's the amount of work, and if that's the that you have to put in order to advance in your career, if that's the only way to advance, maybe you can't do that. Maybe that's your limitation. Accepting these things is terribly difficult, sometimes heartbreaking, but that is self-care because you are working on your well-being, and you're also opening up a space for yourself to find a sustainable and yet meaningful path forward. So acknowledging our boundaries and limitations is very important. Psychotherapy is also a form of self-care, and even if you finish Trick Stop or whatever form of treatment you decide on for hair pulling, it is very useful to have a therapist that you will see once a week, or I don't know, once every 2 weeks, or whatever you can afford, or whatever the therapist recommends, because it's just a space to evaluate your experience, to see where you are in life and where you want to be. It's a place where you get in touch with your feelings, where you can assess your needs. So it's a good check-in point. And because psychotherapy requires another person, and because it is something you pay for, you're much more likely to be accountable and regular than if you just tell yourself, I'll journal once a week, for example. Journaling is also an excellent way to do self-care. However, it is very difficult to be compliant. And then obviously healthy lifestyle is something that significantly contributes. We know from very limited research and clinical experience that sometimes hair pulling can be associated with bad diet, for example, with iron deficiency. Sometimes people report feeling more urges when they eat sugars. Although I haven't seen any research to confirm this, it's something that I've heard hundreds of times over the years from clients. So I think it might have some merit to it. So all or having enough exercise to regulate your anxiety levels and your stress levels, all these are self-care strategies. This is absolutely necessary. You don't have to implement all of these or even most of these because every person's different. So you have to see what's important for you. If there's a specific category that you resist and think is stupid or aren't willing to try, start with that one because that usually means that that one is particularly important. Sorry, once again. So when I talked about acknowledging your boundaries, there's a specific category that I think is very important for people who struggle with BFRBs, and that's interpersonal relations. You have a quote by Rumi here. It says, "Never give from the depths of your well, but from your overflow." Um, I don't know why that is, but I have noticed a significant correlation over the years. The people who come to therapy because of a body focused repetitive behavior tend to be either people pleasers or just kind of seeking validation and confirmation from others. So that means that you're very likely to have trouble setting boundaries and saying no to things. This is again a process, but it's something that can be learned. It's a skill. It's something that drains you of energy if you don't have it. And if you have that skill, you can protect yourself and give as much as you have to give and not more than that. So this is quite difficult because this can affect very personal relationships. That means that maybe you will have to change some rules that you have in your personal relationships, let's say with your partners, or with your children, or with your friends. So this part is very difficult, but it's a great favor to do, for yourself. Like on a very basic level, you can learn where your boundaries are, and then just buy a book about assertive communication and just learn how to communicate those boundaries properly, and then demand that these boundaries are being respected. But because when you focus on having self-esteem, self-esteem is always dependent on the feedback that we get. So self-esteem is always oriented towards other people. I need someone to tell me that I'm good at my job. I need someone to tell me that I'm worthy of love, right? So when that's your reasoning, then you're essentially always trapped by other people. And if they don't give you the validation, it typically makes people quite anxious because you don't know if you're doing well or not. And that can provoke pulling in the long run. Whereas if you shift your focus from self-esteem to self-worth, you find ways to validate yourself. And when you find ways to validate yourself, then the feedback that people give you is important and informative because it will tell you uh, what the state of your friendships is, or it will tell you, um, I don't know, like whether or not you're sticking to your values. But ultimately, when you act because you know that's that's as best as you can do right now, and you don't question your worth and that you're worthy of love. So this is something that belongs to the self-care, maybe a crossover between self-care and psychotherapy. But this is something that you don't need a therapist to work on. So you can do this on your own. It's something that takes a lot of time, but it will remove a lot of those nasty risk factors. That means that, if your boss is upset with you, if you know your worth, you might only hear what's actually relevant in your boss's words, and insults will just kind of roll off of you. That's something that I always quite enjoyed, I have to say, because this area that is particularly troubling to people, I've always had a very easy time with, because I grew up never kind of comparing myself to other people. Not that I was oblivious to them, I was just kind of following my own path. And then when people try to criticize me or guilt me into doing something, I find that highly amusing, because I usually have my own agenda and I know what I want to achieve and what my intention is. And then when I see people trying to pull me in different directions by kind of giving me negative feedback and thinking that that will in any way affect me, I really do find that very amusing. So that would be self care. Then we'll move on to precautionary measures. Whereas, so here I think it's important to clarify the distinction between triggers and risk factors. When we talked about self care, we talked about setting boundaries, we talked about having a healthier lifestyle, we talked about reducing your stress or anxiety. Uh, so those are all risk factors. If you're anxious or tired or overworked or overwhelmed, you're much more likely to pull. So every little thing can trigger you. So risk factors are dealt with by using appropriate self-care routines. And then we still have triggers. Those are those immediate things that will trigger us. It can be a conflict with someone, it can be an intense emotion. It's something that arises in the moment, and then it takes you towards pulling. And then we use precautionary measures to deal with triggers. So I see a lot of you raising your hands. Just please remember that I will give you my email address, and then you can email me all your questions afterwards. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say. So I want to give you a few examples of precautionary measures. Stimulus control techniques are a very clear example of this. If you haven't been in our program, or you're not there, you probably don't know what stimulus control is. So we had a whole webinar, I think, a couple of months ago on stimulus control. Essentially, stimulus control is anything, any kind of action that you take, or a change in your environment that you make, that will lead to the reduction of urges to pull, or that will prevent you from pulling. So some popular or not so popular but effective examples of stimulus control would be wearing gloves, band-aids, or finger covers, or wearing a hat, for example. Can also be staying far away from the mirror. It can be wearing noisy and heavy bracelets around your on your wrists, because that way you'll be more mindful of your hands, and then you'll notice when they're kind of reaching up towards your hair. Those would be stimulus control things, or like watching less TV. If watching TV leads to pulling, right? If you pull in one room, then stimulus control could be to change that room, change the furniture, or spend less time in that room. If you pull when you're alone, then it's finding ways to be engaged when you're alone, or to be alone more rarely. So all these would be stimulus control techniques. Learning to say no is an excellent stimulus control, is an excellent precautionary measure, because that way you can balance your workload and your stress levels, and counteract your people pleasing tendencies if you have any. Learning to tolerate difficult emotions is maybe the most important one. If you remember our previous webinars, we frequently conceptualize pulling and BFRBs in general as being avoidant behaviors. So if you're anxious, you really don't want to process that anxiety, because it's difficult to sit there and feel it, or maybe because it points to certain areas of your life that need radical change and you're not willing to make those changes. So what you do then, you use pulling as a way to escape from that anxiety. This is especially true for pulling trances, those long, intense episodes when you zero in on pulling and it's like everything else in the world doesn't exist or at least isn't important in the moment. So when you learn how to tolerate difficult emotions, then you can tolerate the urge without having to act on it. You can tolerate anxiety without having to escape it, and so on. This may seem like a very tall order, but tolerating difficult emotions is a skill. It's quite literally something that you can learn. So it's not as difficult as it sounds. So self care deals with risk factors, triggers we remove with different precautionary measures. Um, so, as I mentioned, throughout the program and therapy in general, you will go through a number of techniques. When you're making your relapse prevention plan, you need to evaluate all these techniques and reduce them to the smallest number that work in all situations where you might need one. The reason for this is because when we formulate our relapse prevention plan, we're thinking long term. So we're thinking behaviors that you will introduce and maintain for an extended period of time. If you have 7 competing responses that work, that you can use to substitute pulling with, you cannot maintain 7 habits like that. In fact, I would argue that you cannot even introduce 7 habits at the same time. That's just extremely difficult and very likely to fail. So what you want to do is you want to create 2 lists here. One list is a list of techniques that are applicable in all the situations where you pull, or at least you can take all the techniques that you've tried and then rank them in terms of how comprehensive they are or how widely applicable they are. And then another list that shows how efficient these techniques are. So to give you an example, I have a worry stone here, right? So it's something that you can use and rub when you feel the urge to pull. This is something that you can use nearly all the time. You can use it when you're with other people. It fits in your pocket. You can carry it everywhere. You can use it when you're alone. So in that sense, it's very convenient because it's usable in nearly every situation that you can think of. However, the question is whether this is efficient for you in all those situations. If it is, excellent, very easy to use, right? But if it's not efficient, if it's only efficient in like 30% of the cases, you might want to keep a worry stone here and there. But overall, it shouldn't be a part of your relapse prevention plan. A part of your relapse prevention plan should be just 1 or 2 techniques that are very efficient in most situations. Here on the left side on this picture, you have Baoding balls. This is something that for a while, a lot of people used as a competing response, but I've noticed that lately no one has been mentioning that from my clients. Um, those are, they're called Baoding balls, but people also call them Chinese meditation balls. And they're particularly useful when you feel like you have a lot of energy in your fingers and when you feel like they have to move. The way that they work is that you put them both in your hand and then basically spin them in circles. So that requires a degree of focus and it exercises your muscles, so it releases some tension as well. That's just another example of a decent competing response. If you're not able to do this, so when you make these 2 lists that I suggested, you kind of cross them over and nothing stands out, you can consider creating a self-soothing kit or several self-soothing kits and then keep them in those places, like one at the office, one at home, or wherever you need one. A self-soothing kit is essentially a collection of different techniques that can all help boost your confidence and reduce pulling. I don't have time right now to explain because this webinar would be quite long. We can maybe have a whole webinar on this. I can also forward you a text with instructions on how to create a self-soothing kit and with suggestions on what to include in one. So if you're interested in learning how to make a self-soothing kit, just email me after the webinar, and on Monday, because I don't work tomorrow, on Monday I will send them to all of you. Uh, so these tend to be quite useful for clients who cannot find one or two techniques, but instead need a lot of tools. And then a self-soothing kit is there to help you choose whatever you need in the moment. So that's something that can also be convenient. So now we move on to another group, which is first aid techniques. So when I was talking about these techniques here, those are the techniques that you're supposed to establish as habits. So it's something that you use daily in those situations that are anxiety inducing or stressful or places where you tend to pull sometimes. So even if you're in remission, I advise that as part of your relapse prevention, you continue to use these. This is why I wrote discipline and techniques, because discipline is required. It's very tempting to ditch all these techniques once you stop pulling or once you reduce pulling. But that in itself is a self-sabotaging strategy, because if you get rid of what helps, why wouldn't you pull when the urge arises next time around, right? Um, so first aid techniques, in contrast to the ones that I mentioned previously, are not meant to be used every day. They're meant to be used in those situations when a sudden urge will arise. So when you're extremely tempted to pull, that's when you will use I see some of you are sending me your email addresses here. I don't know how to access. I'm not very smart when it comes to technology. I have no idea how to access this. My email address, let me give you one now if some of you have to leave. My email address is vladimir@trickstop.com. So it's very, very simple to remember. Let me I will answer now in private to the person that just emailed me, because they use their name. I don't want to make it available to everyone. So Vladimir, VLADIMIR at trickstop.com. So that's my email. You can send me an email and just say, please send me the resources for that you mentioned at the webinar. I listed them all already, so I'll just copy paste it and send it to you. So back to first aid. Sorry for the interruption. Um, so a first aid technique is essentially something that you use in those situations when urges arise suddenly, unpredictably, and when they're very strong. These can be anything. They can be competing responses, just specific ones. They can be breathing exercises. They can be relaxation exercises. The rule of thumb is just to keep it very simple and to have just one. Because first aid is not something you're supposed to think about for very long. It's something you just know that you need to use and you use it immediately. So, not a lot of thinking. I personally prefer those things that you can see. For example, this is a cube made out of some kind of foam. I don't know what it is, but it's extremely it's extremely flexible, very bendy, and you can kind of crunch it like this. And if you let it stand, it will take its normal shape very easily. Now, I bought this just to test it when one of my clients suggested it, and I love playing with it. The reason why I think this is a decent first aid technique is because if the urge is very intense, you can use this, squeeze it very tightly, you can twist it, you can push your nails inward, you can even rip parts of it off. Because when the urge has a lot of energy, then you need a first aid technique that will get that energy out. It doesn't have to be elegant, right? You can even use something like a piece of paper and then tear it into little pieces. The point is just to get that out of your system. So first aid techniques are typically not very gentle. If you want to try breathing exercises, for example, box breathing can be a very good first aid technique, but it'll take 4 or 5 minutes to work. I can also, if you send me an email and ask for resources, I can also send you a guided exercise that I recorded for a course that I was doing on how to manage anxiety a while ago. Um, so this is not a guided meditation. It's just a recording of me telling you what to do with your hands and with your breathing. So it's kind of a combination of certain gestures and breathing exercises that tend to be very calming for anxiety. And I also used a lot of a lot of the stuff that you do in this guided exercise involve your hands, so it might be very useful for people who struggle with BFRBs. So I can give you that audio recording. You can keep it on your phone and then play it every time when you feel an intense urge. And if you do everything that I tell you to do there, that can be quite beneficial and quite useful. So I see a lot of people here asking me to send them. So I gave you my email, and if you stick around for about 5 minutes until I'm done, you will see my email written on the screen. So you have to send me an email, and then I will send you the information, because that's the simplest and fastest way, I think, to do it. Um, okay, so we have one more slide, and then I will show you my email, and then we are done for today. So we have the deeper work. So what do I mean by this? This is only a part of so you can't just do this and say, I have my relapse prevention plan. But underneath any symptom, so hair pulling included, you have deeper issues. Sometimes it's trauma, sometimes it's, I don't know, separation issues, issues with setting boundaries, self-worth issues, um, quite literally anything, because every person is different and they have their own different experiences. Working on these will eventually reduce the urges. What I usually tell my clients is that what's reasonable to aim for in therapy is to reduce and even eliminate pulling altogether. But when it comes to never feeling the urge to pull again, that seems like a very impractical goal to me. For the very for a very simple reason, which is that we can't dictate our emotional experiences. But if you have self-worth issues and the urge comes about, as a result of you being triggered and feeling unworthy in certain situations, if you actually just explore that lack of self-worth and work on changing that, that will make the urges rarer. Does that mean that you'll never feel the urge again? Not necessarily. But what you can also do is work on how you relate to your emotions. You can learn how to tolerate and be non-reactive to emotions. This is where really serious long-term mindfulness practice does wonders, because you learn not to get too attached to your emotional responses. So doing this deeper work will kind of eliminate causes, and then of course, as a consequence, reduce the urge itself. Maybe not eliminate it completely, but certainly reduce it. The reason why I say that it won't eliminate it completely is because when we have um, like pulling, even if you stop pulling and you never pull again, pulling is a part of your repertoire of behaviors. Once it has been introduced, it's there. So you might have thoughts about pulling in difficult times, but it's not because you have to pull and you've failed. It's simply because for years that was your solution for difficult situations. So of course, in a difficult situation, thoughts about pulling might come about. But if you do the work, you might not be as tempted to actually follow through. Um, so just one short note on this. You might realize that I've just described a set of rather sweeping changes that you have to make. And you might wonder, like, do I really need all this? Is all this really necessary? Because all I want to do is stop pulling my hair. Uh, my answer is that you likely need at least one in each of these categories to prevent a relapse, but not all of them, because I mean, no one needs all of them. But it is absolutely wrong to look at pulling as just a bad habit that has no psychological background. Uh, because if it were that simple, you'd never need psychotherapy to deal with it. So a symptom of any kind is always a function of our psyche. And our psyche is formed in from our lived experience. So from our environment and circumstances in which we live. So if we learned that we should always be productive and then we overwork ourselves and end up pulling, yes, you have to work on productivity and you have to work on this idea that you must be productive in order to be, a valuable member of society, because that is what is leading you to pull. You can't deal just with the end of the line. You have to remove the whole process. So maybe you don't need all of these. It's actually better not to do all of these because it's too much and too confusing. but choose that what's absolutely necessary and absolutely burning, what needs to be changed, no matter how difficult it is and how much resistance you feel. Put in the effort anyway, and it will pay off. So this is all I had to say. As always, I want to thank Trinkstop for allowing us to meet here. Um, for those of you who don't know, we always offer a discount after each webinar. So if you want to join the program in the next week, you can get $100 discount for the first month if you use this promo code right here.